At 3:10 AM on the 7th of June 1917, the entire Western Front was rocked by arguably the loudest man-made explosion in the history of the world to that point, as a series of enormous subterranean mines killed thousands and literally shattered the German stronghold that was the Messines Ridge. Within moments, Allied troops were charging into the attack to drive the stunned defenders from their trenches. Amongst those troops were the highly regarded men of the Australian Imperial Force. This is the story of the Battle of Messines. In order to tell the story of that battle, we need to go back in time to 1916. It was in March of that year when the first Australian troops landed on the Western Front, some direct from Australia, others after having survived the horrors of Gallipoli. Whatever their personal circumstances, all were volunteers and all were willing to fight. Since that time, the Australians had proved their mettle in the heat of the Somme at Pozieres, in the ill-fated attack at Fromelles, and in the fields around the village of Bulcourt. All had been costly, but all had shown just what a potent force the Anzacs could be. And Anzacs they were, men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. In total, 5 Aussie divisions would see action on the Western Front, but in this video, we'll focus on just 2. The first of these, the 3rd Australian Division, was commanded by none other than Sir John Monash, future commander of all Australian troops on the Western Front. It was raised in early 1916 from new recruits and a scattering of hardened Gallipoli veterans from the 3rd Anzac Brigade. They drew their troops from all corners of Australia, with each state represented amongst its ranks. Despite being on the Western Front since November 1916 as a complete formation, Messines would be their first time in offensive action. By June 1917, they formed part of the 2nd Anzac Corps, alongside the capable New Zealand Division and the British Kitchener's Army 25th Division. Let's take a moment to understand a few commonly used terms in the Great War in reference to military units, what exactly they represent and how they interconnect in the military structure of the time. The most basic unit in the First World War was the section, made up of usually 12 men and led by a corporal. 4 sections made up a platoon of around 50 men under the command of a lieutenant or second lieutenant with a sergeant assisting. 4 platoons made up a company, officially 227 men, often commanded by a major or a captain. Those 4 companies, along with the machine gun section, battalion headquarters and various specialist troops, made a battalion. Commanded by a lieutenant colonel, it was, on paper at least, around 30 officers and 1,000 men in all. For most of the war, 4 battalions formed a brigade, commanded, unsurprisingly, by a brigadier general. Again, with various attached troops, it was about 4,000 men in total. Finally, 3 brigades, usually, made a division. Commanded by a major general, this consisted of a total of 12 infantry battalions, 3 field artillery brigades, 2 engineer field companies, 1 signal company, 1 divisional ammunition column, 3 field ambulances and various additional specialist troops. All told, a complement of some 16 to 18,000 men. Attached to the 2nd Anzac Corps, specifically for the Messines offensive, were a 2nd Australian formation, the 4th Division. Formed in Egypt from the former 4th Brigade of Gallipoli fame, they'd arrived in France in spring 1916, serving briefly in the quiet Armentières sector before moving to the Somme. Throughout July and August, the division had been heavily engaged in the fighting around the German stronghold of Pozieres and Mouquet Farm. Just a few months before Messines, 4th Div had again seen action and suffered considerable losses at Bulcourt. Despite many new recruits joining its ranks, 4th Div was, by mid-1917, a highly experienced and battle-hardened formation. So why Messines? Well, by June 1917, the Western Front looked something like this. Stretching for more than 400 miles from the border of Switzerland to the English Channel, it covered both France and Belgium, with the British and therefore British Empire contingent based largely in the north of that line, in this region. Really, since mid-1915, the Allies had been the aggressors, making regular and costly efforts to drive the invading Germans back towards their own borders. This had seen tragically little success. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 had ended in bloody stalemate, though it had forced the Germans to withdraw to a new position known as the Hindenburg Line. The French Nivelle offensive in spring 1917 had been a disaster on the other hand, and very nearly ended in full-scale mutiny. The British attack to support that offensive around the town of Arras had been, day for day, the bloodiest of the war, but by June, Allied eyes had turned north to the infamous Ypres salient. The plan had always been to launch an attack around Ypres in the summer of 1917 to drive the Germans from the heights around the town, capture the supply hub of Roulers, modern-day Roeselare, and hopefully knock out the German-held Belgian Channel ports from which their U-boats had been savaging Atlantic shipping. But in order for that to happen, the gatekeeper to Ypres had first to fall, the Messines Ridge. Let's take a look. Located on the southern edge of the Ypres salient, a distinctly curving section of line that skirted that Belgian town, the Messines Ridge was a strategically vital piece of ground controlling the southern part of the Ypres battlefield. Covering only 7 kilometers as the crow flies, it was a crescent-shaped ridge running from the area of Ploegstert, known at the time as Plug Street, in the south, through to the town of Messines and Vieschater, known as White Sheets, then to the village of Saint-Éloi and onto the notorious Hill 60 near the village of Zillebeek. Like most features named ridges on the northern part of the Western Front, it wasn't particularly tall or steep, but it did force the Allies to fight uphill and crucially had views northwards towards the Ypres salient proper. In short, whoever held that ground could attack into the flank of anyone assaulting Ypres and stop any offensive before it could make significant gains. So, gaining the high ground and crucially holding it was absolutely vital for the Allies before the battle we today know as Passchendaele could commence. Let's overlay this fascinating wartime trench map to understand the ground as it was in 1917. The red lines here, accurate to within a few meters, show the depth and strength of German defences along the ridge. As we see, there were a veritable spider's web of interconnected positions, linked by communication trenches and protected by thick coils of barbed wire, marked here by crosses. Stretching hundreds of meters rearwards, they show that in 1917, capturing an area of trench line wasn't simply a case of grabbing the enemy's frontline trench, but rather penetrating deep behind their lines and capturing the fortified nearby towns and villages too. The British lines here, in the lower ground, can be seen in blue, with the infamous no man's land ranging from 100 to 500 meters separating the two. Now, by adding the various Allied units in place, we can understand just where they were located. In total, some 10 Allied divisions will be involved in the coming attack. Moving north to south, we have the British 23rd, 47th, 41st and 19th Divisions, with the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster Divisions advancing for the first time side by side in the centre. Then the 25th British, followed by the New Zealand, 3rd Australian and 4th Australian Divisions in the southern part of the line, facing the town of Messines itself. It's this sector on which our focus will fall. Facing them across no man's land were 5 divisions of the German Group Vieschater, namely the 204th Württembergers, the Prussian 2nd and 35th, and the 3rd and 4th Bavarian divisions, with several more specialist counterattack units held in reserve, a formidable force. In order to carry such a strongly defended part of the German line, a bold plan and bold commander were needed. Enter General Herbert Plumer, commanding the 2nd Army. Highly experienced and well regarded, he'd spent nearly 2 years in the Ypres area and so knew the terrain well, and most importantly, he was a meticulous planner who had handpicked his staff officers for their skill at their trade. Plumer was very much aware that for the most part, large-scale, set-piece attacks across the Western Front since 1915 had been very costly and ineffective affairs, and so he set about his plan with every detail scrutinised. Nothing would be left to chance. As soon as his infantry assault formations had been chosen, they were taken out of the front line, shown large-scale models of the ground to be attacked, given the opportunity to train, study aerial reconnaissance photos, and take part in multiple rehearsal attacks over ground that had been specifically chosen to represent that of the battlefield. The infantry would be fully prepared when the time came. But this wasn't a job for infantry alone. In order to maximise the chances of success, cooperation was key. To cover the infantry as they assaulted uphill, an unprecedented 2,266 guns of varying calibers were brought into the area to lay down a complex creeping barrage ahead of the advancing troops, keeping the enemy gunners' heads down and neutralising their artillery batteries. At the same time, aircraft would be employed above the battlefield to disrupt enemy troop movements, report targets for the artillery, and correct the fall of shells. One further new weapon, the tank, would also go into action. By now, the British had introduced the more reliable Mark IV tank, which could be used to knock out enemy strong points, whilst older Mark II variants were to be filled with supplies to keep the leading infantry in the fight. Vitally, neither logistics nor communications, the regular Achilles heels on the Western Front, were overlooked. Plank roadways were laid to allow faster movement of supplies and reinforcements over the shattered ground. Landlines and communication cables were dug deep into the earth to keep them safe from enemy artillery, and hundreds of kilometres of light and heavy gauge railways laid to quickly move supplies up and wounded back from the front lines. Plumer had one more unexpected ace left to play for the coming assault: mines. One of the very few advantages for an attacker of the Messines Ridge was, ironically, the very thing that made them so formidable in the first place: elevation. As the ridge naturally sat higher than the Allied positions, it provided a tempting opportunity to quite literally undermine them. And that's exactly what happened. With great foresight, months before the actual attack at Messines had been tabled, the Allies had begun digging. The result was a series of complex attack tunnels and mining galleries running out, in some cases for hundreds of metres, directly beneath the very strongest of the enemy's positions. In total, 23 tunnels had been dug in complete secrecy and the most trying conditions. Once directly under the enemy's strong points, huge caches of explosives had been placed, totalling more than £930,000. Fuses inserted, and the entire tunnels then backfilled to force the blast upwards at the moment of firing. By early June, all were ready, though some changes to the battlefield above ground meant that on 0 hour, 19 of the 23 mines would actually be fired, the hope being that the enemy's main defensive positions would be obliterated in moments, opening the way for the assaulting infantry. Finally, with plans complete, and the men as ready as they could be, the date for the attack was set: 7th of June 1917. As the British, Irish, New Zealander and Australian troops filtered up to the front line in darkness on the 6th of June, the tension was palpable amongst both the men to lead the advance and those who'd planned the attack. New Zealander rifleman Malcolm McCaskill had managed to find a few moments to rush a short letter home to his siblings.
My dearest Ern and Paul, just a few lines to you before going over the top. We're going into battle in 6 hours' time, so God only knows what will happen. The artillery fire now is like a living hell, and by this time tomorrow, things will be a lot worse. You cannot imagine it without seeing it for yourself. If we are successful, it means a lot to the Western Front. As to the place we have to take, it is a very strong position. So I hope we will be successful. Everything is high tension now. One feels quite excited until zero time arrives. Well, I meant to write much, but I cannot possibly put my mind to it. But I hope to have the luck and come through it all right. Remember me to everyone, the Treblies, Peter and Jim, and all the Cockadine folk when you write to them. I'm just sending a field card to Maud, as I have no more writing material. I shall send you one as soon as we come through this stunt, if lucky. Au revoir for this time. From your loving bro.
At a conference behind the lines that same night, And thinking of the incredible power of the sequence of mines about to go up, British General Charles Harrington famously quipped, "Gentlemen, we may not make history tomorrow, but we shall certainly change the geography." He wasn't wrong. By 2:50 AM all were in place, and the guns which had been pounding the enemy positions paused. At the same time, many onlookers recalled a summer storm breaking over the battlefield, eerily lighting the entire area. Men waited anxiously for 0, having been told, unusually, to wait with their mouths open at 3:10 to prevent the enormous concussion of the mines from perforating their eardrums. To the northern end of the Messines battlefield, at Hill 60, Australian tunnellers had taken over 2 mines, one on Hill 60 itself and the other around a nearby feature known as the Caterpillar, with total charges of some 70,000 and 50,000 pounds of ammonol respectively. Let's just pause the action for a moment to consider the role of tunnellers in the Great War, in which Australians played a prominent role. Known today for their offensive actions like this one at Messines, tunnelling was also an important defensive measure in the era of attritional warfare, where the ability to keep troops safe from the ever-present shell fire was paramount. As a result, literally hundreds of miles of tunnels, ranging from huge subways to small attack tunnels, were dug beneath the Western Front from 1915 onwards. In many cases, the men doing the digging were not professional soldiers, but professional miners. Brought in from places like the northeast of England and New South Wales Hunter Valley, these men knew their trade and had often been doing it for years. So desirable was that specialism that the rate of pay for tunnellers was significantly higher, as was the upper age limit for service in the military. The lives at the front for those men were almost exclusively subterranean, not only battling the usual and many dangers of mining in peacetime, but also, of course, the enemy. With specialist miners and pioneers beneath the German lines trying to detect their enemy underground, place their own charges beneath those tunnels and collapse them on their opponents, or, on rare occasions, break into enemy tunnels armed with pistols, bayonets and trench clubs, it was an extremely nerve-wracking and dangerous experience for all involved. All told, more than 4,000 Australians would serve in some capacity as part of the Australian tunnelling companies on the Western Front. Many are still there. Perhaps best known of all, largely thanks to the recent film Beneath Hill 60, is Captain Oliver Woodward of the 1st Australian Tunnelling Company. He was present at Messines and was charged with igniting the 2 mines beneath the German lines that morning. He recalled,
"It is difficult to describe that last half hour. A beautiful, clear, starlit night, as calm a night from a bombardment point of view as had ever existed on that much contested front. An occasional rear light falling like a bright meteorite, and a less occasional crack of fire. Fire. Nothing seemed to happen. My impression was that the mines had failed to go off. Then there was a dull thud, as if a dud shell had landed some distance away, and then a peculiar earth tremor under our feet. Another and another, stronger and stronger, seeming to come in waves from below."
Watching on over the battlefield as the awesome spectacle unfolded was war correspondent Philip Gibbs. He recalled the sight.
Out of the dark ridges of Messines, Works Arter and that ill-famed Hill 60, there gushed out and up enormous volumes of scarlet flames from the exploding mines. Earth and smoke, all lighted by the flames, spilled over into fountains of fierce colour, so that all the countryside was illuminated by red light. Where some of us stood watching, aghast and spellbound by this burning horror, the ground trembled and surged violently to and fro. Truly the earth quaked.
For those German defenders unfortunate enough to be in the vicinity of the explosions, yet lucky enough to still be alive, the effect was remarkable, as Lieutenant von Kessenstein recalled.
"After a dreadful crash came the shrieks of many voices in pain and fear. Chunks of concrete, steel splinters and fire cascaded over us. Men scattered, as though a herd of wild animals had been disturbed. One man, with his left arm dangling, was racing around the cratered area like a lunatic. One man lay still in the powder-blackened crater, his body lacerated by numerous wounds, also let out his final blow of agony, and voices called for medical orderlies. I raced after the company clerk, grabbed him, and forced him back into the trench. In a state of collapse, he leaned back against the wall of the trench, and I amputated his arm just below the shoulder with my pocket knife.
Then came the infantry. Let's move down to follow the men of 2nd Anzac Corps. It was in this area around Plug Street Wood that the men of the 3rd Australian Division and their New Zealander comrades found themselves prior to the mines going off. Added to that, and captured in this remarkable snapshot of history by a reconnaissance aircraft overflying the battlefield, was the artillery bombardment of the enemy front line, which caused chaos amongst the already disorientated defenders. It was the combined effect of the mines and artillery which paved the way for the advancing Anzacs. Despite having suffered some casualties to enemy gas and high explosive shell fire as they formed up, the as yet untried men of the 3rd Australian Division, tasked with capturing the ground to the northeast of Messines, began their advance behind the protection of that creeping barrage. Let's switch to the drone. Advancing towards the burning town of Messines in the distance, this road formed a rough boundary, with the men of the New Zealand Division attacking on the left of it up the slopes towards Messines itself, and the 3rd Australian Division alongside them to their right. For the most part, they met light resistance. The few Germans they did see were simply too stunned by the ferocity of the mines and bombardment to mount an effective defence. That said, the Aussies didn't have it all their own way, with a single machine gun in these fields playing havoc on the advancing waves until, assaulted at point-blank range by Aussie troops with grenades, it was silenced. Further to the right too, several machine guns opened up, hitting the advancing Aussies with enfilade fire from the flank. These too were only silenced after men dashed up with the bayonet behind a shower of grenades. All told, the first wave saw remarkable success, and by 5 AM, when the second wave began their advance, the leading Aussies possessed all of their objectives, with relatively light casualties. Pushing on across these very fields, the Aussies took in short succession Bethlehem Farm on the outskirts of Messines, and then Ungodly Trench as their neighbours in the New Zealand Division advanced into Messines itself. Again, isolated machine guns were met, but working to their rear they were eventually surrounded and silenced, with the crews killed or taken prisoner. Having reached their objective with great determination, men began to consolidate and await the inevitable German counterattack. There's an important and often overlooked fact we should consider here with regards to consolidating newly won trenches. Once captured, enemy trenches were almost always unusable for defence. Often as much as 7 feet deep, they usually required a fire step dug into the front edge to be mounted before an infantryman could fire out over them. Understandably, the Germans, when occupying a trench, would dig only one fire step, that on the side facing the enemy. Once captured, the new occupiers found the fire step was facing the wrong way, and so captured trenches routinely needed to be reversed before they could be used. This was always a precarious time when facing the Germans, whose entire doctrine was one based on ferocious counterattacks. Fortunately, at Messines, the shell fire in advance had been so thorough and fast that initial job could be completed in relative peace. To the Aussies' left, the New Zealanders were by now entering the shattered remains of Messines. By blending this aerial image of the time over the modern village today, we see just how destructive artillery fire was in the Great War, with hardly a brick, let alone a building, left standing by the end of the battle. It was in these ruins that the New Zealanders fought hand to hand with the remaining Bavarian defenders, eventually capturing the distinctive church, rebuilt today as it was in 1917, along with the German garrison commander signalling an end to that phase of the fight. With control of Messines Ridge so vital to both sides, it should come as no surprise that the Germans were unwilling to give up. Having recovered from the shock of that morning, the fight went on throughout the day, with artillery of both sides inflicting heavy losses and further destruction on the landscape. It was eventually at 3:10 PM, exactly 12 hours after the 1st Infantry had started the attack, that the men of 4th Australian Division were to take up the fight. Having started that day in reserve, these tough veterans of the fight at Bulcourt were now to launch the second phase of the attack. Their objective, the German positions in an area known as the Oosterwern Line, lay right here, beyond Messines. These positions had not seen the same kind of barrage that the enemy front line had, and with numerous concrete bunkers protecting the defenders would prove a very tough nut to crack. As the Aussies pushed forward across these fields towards the camera, targeting the positions which are today marked by the Oostervern Cemetery, they came under withering fire and many men fell. Pinned down in these fields, it took individual examples of incredible courage to unlock the German defence. Conspicuous was Captain Robert Grieve of the 37th Victoria Battalion, who single-handedly silenced several pillboxes by rolling grenades through the firing apertures before himself being wounded in the shoulder by sniper fire. For his gallantry, he would earn the Victoria Cross and lived until 1957, eventually marrying the Australian nurse who treated him in hospital. By the end of that very first day, almost all of the Allied objectives for the Messines Ridge assault had been achieved, and whilst bitter fighting went on for 3 more days as the Germans desperately tried to regain control of that vital ground, by the 11th of June, with both sides utterly exhausted, they withdrew, and the battle for the Messines Ridge was over. In truth, when studying the Great War, it's not easy to find an Allied battle in which complete success can be claimed. Messines is unusual in that regard. It was, to many observers, a masterstroke, a complete victory the likes of which had not been seen anywhere on the British part of the Western Front to that point. That said, even success came with a horrific cost. All told, British, Irish, Australian and New Zealanders suffered some 25,000 casualties in the battle, with 2nd Anzac Corps alone losing 12,400 men killed, wounded or captured. German losses are less precise, but are perhaps as high as 30,000. The real prize, though, was the ground. With the Messines Ridge captured and held, the door was open for the next battle of that year, one which would go down in infamy, and for many Australians would be their last. Passchendaele. Today, the Messines Ridge has largely returned to nature. Most of the scars of the fighting here in 1917 have gone. The village is rebuilt and the fields returned to agriculture. Though beneath ground, there are still several powerful reminders of what once happened here. Of those famous mines to blow on the opening day, 3 were never fired. Today, 2 still exist, including one right here, under Petit Douve Farm, left undisturbed for a century. One further mine, in the same sector in which the Aussies attacked, did detonate, but 32 years after the battle, struck by lightning in a thunderstorm. The only casualty, a cow. The real reminder of what happened across these fields, though, can be found in memorials proudly standing on the spot where divisions, battalions and individual men fought and fell, and, with the dozens of pristine cemeteries dotting the landscape, the final resting place of those who never left the Messines Ridge. Of course, the story of the Australian Imperial Force on the Western Front would go on, with many more bitter battles to come. If you found this episode interesting, then be sure to check out the other videos in this series to learn more about the Australians in the First World War. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.